May 9, 1943. Aberdeen, Scotland, 6:20 p.m. Two Spitfires close in on a lone Junkers Jew, 88 night fighter approaching British airspace. The RAF pilots tense, fingers on triggers. But instead of evasive action, the German aircraft does something extraordinary. It lowers its landing gear, drops its flaps, launches red flares. The enemy pilot isn't attacking. He's surrendering. And he's brought with him the most closely guarded secret in Hitler's Luftwaffe. Inside that aircraft, mounted behind a forest of ungainly antenna arrays nicknamed the Mattress, sits Germany's most advanced night fighter radar system, the Liechtenstein BC. The technology that had been turning RAF bomber crews into statistics over the skies of occupied Europe. Within 48 hours, British physicists would have their hands on this prize. Within a week, they would begin tests that would reveal something shocking, something that would change the entire course of the night war over Germany. The Luftwaffe's all-seeing eyes were failing, and they didn't even know it. Let's rewind to understand why this moment matters so much. Since 1940, Britain had been conducting an increasingly desperate bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. Every night, hundreds of RAF bombers thundered across the North Sea and Channel, carrying destruction to German cities and industrial targets. And every night, fewer came home. By 1943, Bomber Command was bleeding. Lancaster bombers worth millions of pounds and carrying 7 highly trained crew members were being shot down at catastrophic rates. On some missions, losses exceeded 10%. That's unsustainable mathematics. Keep those numbers up, and Bomber Command would cease to exist within months. The killer stalking Britain's bomber streams wasn't flak, wasn't weather, wasn't mechanical failure. It was the German night fighter force, the Nachtjagd. And at the heart of their success was something RAF intelligence desperately needed to understand: airborne radar. The Germans had created what they called the Kammhuber line, a sophisticated air defense system stretching from Denmark to France. It divided the sky into boxes, each monitored by ground radar stations. When RAF bombers entered a box, a night fighter would be vectored to intercept. The ground controllers would guide the fighter close enough for the pilot to use his airborne radar, the Liechtenstein, to find his prey. Then came the kill. British bomber crews reported seeing German fighters appearing out of nowhere in pitch darkness. No searchlights, no visible pursuit, just sudden, devastating cannon fire from aircraft they never saw coming. The Luftwaffe was hunting with electronic eyes, and RAF crews were dying because of it. British intelligence knew the Germans had airborne interception radar. Intercepted radio communications mentioned something called Emil. Reconnaissance photographs showed strange antenna arrays on the noses of German night fighters. But knowing something exists and understanding how it works are entirely different problems. The British needed to capture one, intact, operational. They needed to examine it, test it, understand its strengths and weaknesses. They needed to get inside the Luftwaffe's electronic brain. And that's exactly what Oberleutnant Herbert Schmid was about to hand them. Herbert Schmid wasn't your typical Nazi pilot. Born in 1914, he was the son of a secretary to Germany's foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann. He'd grown up in an educated diplomatic household. He'd watched the Nazis rise to power. He'd seen what they were capable of. And by 1943, he'd decided he wanted no part of their war. Schmid was stationed at Aalborg in Denmark, flying Junkers Ju-88 night fighters with NJG-3. His aircraft, Werk number 3643, was brand new, fresh from the factory, equipped with the latest Liechtenstein BC radar and all the classified equipment the Luftwaffe could pack into a night fighter. On May 9th, he took off on what was supposed to be a routine patrol over the Skagerrak. His crew consisted of 3 men: Schmid as pilot, Oberfeldwebel Paul Rosenberger as wireless operator and gunner, and flight engineer Feldwebel Erich Cantwil. Only two of them knew what was really about to happen. At 5:10 p.m., shortly after takeoff, Schmid radioed that his starboard engine was on fire. He was going down. The aircraft dropped to sea level. 3 life rafts were jettisoned. To German controllers, it looked like another crew lost to the North Sea, but Schmid's engines were running perfectly. He wasn't going down. He was going across. He turned west and flew low over the water toward Scotland. The 2 Spitfires that intercepted him were piloted by an American and a Canadian serving with 165 Squadron. When they saw the German bomber lower its gear and fire recognition flares, they must have thought they were dreaming. German aircraft didn't defect. Not like this. Not with their most secret technology aboard. They escorted Schmid to Aberdeen, specifically to RAF Dice. The Junkers touched down at 6:20 p.m. Within minutes, the aircraft was surrounded. Schmid and Rosenberger were calm, almost cheerful. They'd succeeded in their plan. Flight engineer Cantwil was a different story. He was a committed Nazi. He hadn't been told about the defection. When he realized what had happened, he had to be removed from the aircraft at gunpoint. His face, witnesses said, was contorted with fury, but the damage was done. The Luftwaffe's secret weapon had just landed in British hands, intact, operational, ready for examination. The next morning, 2 men caught a train from London to Aberdeen. One was Professor R.V. Jones, the brilliant young physicist who headed scientific intelligence for the Air Staff. The other was Squadron Leader Derek Jackson, a physicist who also happened to be a champion jockey. Together, they represented some of the finest scientific minds Britain could field. They arrived on the morning of May 11th and went straight to the captured Junkers. What they saw both excited and intimidated them. The Liechtenstein BC radar was more sophisticated than they'd expected. 4 groups of 8 dipole antennas projected from the nose on 4 ugly masts, creating the characteristic mattress appearance. Inside, 3 cathode ray tube displays showed range, azimuth, and elevation. The system operated at 490 MHz in the UHF band. It could detect targets from 200 meters out to 4 kilometers. For a night fighter pilot, that was devastating capability. Once guided to within 4 kilometers by ground control, he could see his target electronically, track it, and position himself for the kill, all in complete darkness. Jones and Jackson spent hours examining the system. They photographed everything. They traced circuits. They measured frequencies. They took copious notes. This was intelligence gold. But they couldn't fully test the radar at Aberdeen. For that, they needed to get the aircraft to a proper evaluation facility. Within 5 days, the Junkers was given the RAF designation PJ-876 and flown south to RAF Collie Weston in Northamptonshire, home of 1426 Flight, the RAF's enemy aircraft evaluation unit, nicknamed affectionately as the Luftwaffe. There, the real work began. Over the following months, PJ-876 flew dozens of evaluation missions. RAF pilots learned to fly the WWII. Radio operators learned to operate the Liechtenstein radar. Engineers ran the system through every test they could devise. One of the first discoveries was positive for the RAF. The system could be jammed. Strips of aluminum foil, cut to specific lengths corresponding to the radar's wavelength, would create false returns when dropped from aircraft. The British had been developing this countermeasure for years, but had hesitated to deploy it, fearing the Germans would immediately copy it and use it against British radars. Now they knew it would work. The countermeasure was codenamed Window. The Germans, independently, had developed the same concept, which they called Duple. Both sides had been sitting on this technology, each afraid the other would use it first. The capture of the Liechtenstein radar gave Churchill's war cabinet the confidence to authorize Windows use. Within weeks, RAF bombers would start carrying bundles of metallic strips to throw out over Germany, blinding the radar systems guiding both the flak and the night fighters. But that wasn't the most important discovery that emerged from testing PJ-876. That discovery would come later, during a series of tests at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough in July 1943, and it would reveal a fatal flaw. The engineers at Farnborough wanted to understand how the Liechtenstein radar would perform under actual flight conditions. It was one thing to test it on the ground or in gentle evaluation flights, but combat flying was different. High G maneuvers, turbulence, engine vibrations. Would the radar maintain its performance under these conditions? They set up a sophisticated test. The radar components were mounted on a vibration table that could simulate the conditions of high-speed flight. The technicians powered up the system and ran it through its paces. On the bench, sitting still, the Liechtenstein performed perfectly. The cathode ray tubes displayed clear, crisp returns. The system tracked test targets flawlessly. Then they turned on the vibration table, started with low frequencies. The radar kept working. Increased the frequency gradually. Still working. Then they hit 85 Hz. The displays went crazy. Returns became erratic. The system couldn't maintain lock on targets. At the precise vibration frequency that a Ju-88's engines would generate during hard maneuvering or sustained high-speed flight, the Liechtenstein BC radar started to fail. The technicians looked at each other in amazement. They repeated the test. Same results. The vibrations were affecting the mechanical components inside the radar set, particularly the rotating phase shifter mechanism that created the twirling beam used for target tracking. This was extraordinary. This meant that during actual combat, when a night fighter pilot was maneuvering hard to get into position for a kill, his radar was probably giving him degraded or false information. If he was chasing a bomber that was taking evasive action, pushing his engines hard, the very radar he depended on to make the kill was becoming unreliable. Did the Germans know about this? Had they tested their own radar under these conditions? Or had they rushed it into production and deployment without realizing it had this fundamental flaw? The British didn't know, but what they did know was this. The Luftwaffe's electronic eyes were vulnerable, not just to jamming, but to the basic physics of vibration. The radar that was supposed to give German night fighters an insurmountable advantage had a critical weakness built into its very design. This intelligence was immediately classified at the highest level. The fewer people who knew about it, the better. But it informed everything that came after. British bomber tactics, evasive maneuvers, the famous corkscrew technique developed specifically to exploit the Liechtenstein radar's limited cone of coverage. And there was more to come. July 24, 1943. Hamburg, Germany. Operation Gomorrah. 791 RAF bombers took off for Hamburg, one of the largest raids of the war to date. But this time, they carried something new. Bundles of aluminum strips, each cut precisely to 27 centimeters long, half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. At the designated point, wireless operators began throwing bundles of window out of the aircraft. Each bundle burst open, releasing thousands of metallic strips that floated slowly to Earth, each one creating a radar return identical to a large bomber. The effect on German radar operators was immediate and catastrophic. Their screens, which normally showed a few dozen distinct aircraft returns, suddenly erupted with thousands of blips. It looked like an invasion force of biblical proportions. The carefully controlled Kammhuber line system collapsed. Ground controllers couldn't tell which returns were real aircraft and which were chaff. Night fighters couldn't get reliable vectors to targets. The Liechtenstein airborne radars were equally affected. Night fighter pilots found their screens filled with returns. Every piece of aluminum foil looked like a bomber. The careful hunt had become chaos. That night, RAF Bomber Command lost just 12 aircraft out of 791. a loss rate of 1.5%, far below the devastating numbers they'd been experiencing. Hamburg, by contrast, was devastated. Over 40,000 civilians died in the firestorm that followed. The night fighters had been blinded, and the capture of PJ-876 2 months earlier had made it possible. Without understanding exactly how the Liechtenstein radar worked, developing effective countermeasures would have been far more difficult. Now, the British knew its frequency, its beam pattern, its range, and its limitations. The Luftwaffe scrambled to respond. Within weeks, they began deploying a new radar, the Liechtenstein SN2, operating at a much lower frequency of 90 MHz that wasn't as affected by the original window chaff. But this required huge new antenna arrays nicknamed Stag's Antlers, creating so much drag that night fighters lost 30 miles per hour of speed. It was a game of technological leapfrog, and the British were staying one step ahead, thanks in large part to that defecting Junkers sitting at RAF Collie Weston. But the radar war was about to take another turn, and this time it would reveal something even more disturbing about German technological development. February 1943. A few months before Schmid's defection, Rotterdam, Holland. A Sterling bomber, call sign BF-372, limps through the night sky, severely damaged by flak. Aboard is the crew and something extraordinarily secret. An H-2S ground-mapping radar set powered by a cavity magnetron, the most advanced radar technology in the world. The pilot tries to make it back to England, but the damage is too severe. The aircraft crashes near Rotterdam. The self-destruct charges on the H-2S radar fail to detonate. Within hours, German troops have recovered the equipment, mostly intact. The cavity magnetron is rushed to Telefunken laboratories in Berlin. It's a small device, almost elegant in its simplicity. A copper block with precisely machined cavities around a central cathode, capable of generating enormous amounts of microwave power. The British version can produce kilowatts of power at 9.7 centimeter wavelength, perfect for high-resolution radar. German scientists examine it with growing dismay, then shock, then something approaching horror. The technology represented in this small device is at least a decade ahead of anything Germany has produced. The precision machining required, the theoretical understanding of resonant cavities and microwave generation, the materials science needed to handle the power densities. All of it is beyond current German capability. They can copy it, given time, but they cannot replicate the innovation that created it. And that means something terrifying for Nazi Germany's war effort. Despite all the propaganda about German scientific superiority, despite all the resources thrown at military technology, Britain has pulled ahead in one of the most critical technologies of the war. The scientists write their report and send it up the chain of command. The conclusion is devastating. Germany is approximately 10 years behind British radar physics. A decade. In a war that might not last another 2 years, that's an unbridgeable gap. This revelation doesn't become widely known until after the war. But it explains so much about the desperate measures the Luftwaffe would take in 1943 and 1944. The constant revisions to radar systems, the quick deployment of half-tested technology, the vulnerability to Allied countermeasures. The Luftwaffe was fighting with last-generation's eyes against opponents who could see further, more clearly, and in higher resolution. June 14, 1943. 5 weeks after Schmid's defection, British Mosquito night fighters of 141 Squadron take off on a new type of mission. They're not hunting for German bombers. They're hunting for German night fighters, and they have a new tool that makes it possible. Serrate. Serrate is a passive radar detector tuned to receive emissions from German Liechtenstein radars. It can detect a German night fighter's radar from up to 50 miles away. British night fighters can now stalk their German counterparts the same way the WWII. Luftwaffe had been stalking RAF bombers. The development of Serrate would not have been possible without detailed knowledge of the Liechtenstein radar's frequency, pulse characteristics, and emissions. That knowledge came directly from examining PJ-876. German night fighter crews suddenly find themselves in an impossible situation. If they turn on their radar to hunt for British bombers, they make themselves visible to British night fighters equipped with Serrate. If they keep their radar off, they can't find their targets. It's a deadly catch-22 point. British mosquitoes begin shooting down German night fighters with increasing frequency. The hunters are being hunted. Some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced crews, survivors of hundreds of missions, are killed by an enemy they never saw coming. The psychological impact on German night fighter crews is devastating. The confidence born of technological superiority evaporates. Now they're flying into British bomber streams, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, British fighters might be tracking their radar emissions, stalking them for the kill. The Nachtjagd's effectiveness drops. More RAF bombers are getting through. German cities burn. But the most bizarre twist in this story is still to come. And it involves a piece of British technology that was supposed to protect bombers, but instead led them to slaughter. In 1942, the RAF began equipping its bombers with a tail-warning radar called Monica. The system was simple in concept. It pointed backward and alerted the crew if another aircraft was approaching from behind. The idea was to give bomber crews a few precious seconds of warning before a night fighter opened fire. It seemed like a good idea. Bomber crews liked having Monica aboard. It made them feel safer. They could hear the beeping that indicated an aircraft behind them and take evasive action. But Monica had a problem. Like all active radars, it transmitted radio waves. Those transmissions could be detected. And in early 1944, German scientists developed a passive receiver called Flensburg, specifically designed to home in on Monica's emissions. Suddenly, German night fighters didn't need to rely on their temperamental Liechtenstein radars. They could simply tune to the frequency Monica was broadcasting and follow those emissions straight to their target. From up to 50 miles away, RAF bombers equipped with Monica, thinking they were safer, were actually painting themselves with an electronic bullseye. The very system designed to protect them was helping kill them. The British discovered this in July 1944 when another German night fighter made a navigation error. A Ju-88 G1 from NJG-2, piloted by Unteroffizier Hans Mackel, followed a landing beacon to what he thought was an airfield in Holland. It was actually RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England. He landed before realizing his mistake. By then it was too late. British technical intelligence officers were already surrounding the aircraft. This Ju-88 was equipped with both the latest SN2 radar and the Flensburg Monica detector. When British engineers examined the Flensburg equipment and realized what it did, there was brief panic. How long had the Germans been using this? How many bomber crews had died because Monica had betrayed them? Within days, Monica was ordered removed from all RAF bombers. The system that had been installed to save lives had been killing the crews it was supposed to protect. It was a harsh lesson in the radar war. Every transmission you make can be detected, tracked, and exploited. The Luftwaffe had learned this with their Liechtenstein radars being tracked by Serrate. Now the RAF learned it with Monica and Flensburg. In electronic warfare, there are no permanent advantages, only temporary advantages and the constant race to stay ahead. As 1943 turned to 1944, the night war over Germany evolved rapidly. The German air defense system, so carefully constructed, was adapting to British countermeasures. The rigid Kammhuber line system of boxes was abandoned. In its place came new tactics, wild sow or wild boar, using single-seat day fighters over illuminated target areas, and Zamisau, tame boar, where radar-equipped night fighters would follow the bomber stream and freelance their attacks rather than being directed to specific boxes. The British countered by changing their tactics as well. Instead of spreading bombers out, they concentrated them into tight streams that could overwhelm individual defensive boxes. The famous bomber stream tactic was born directly from understanding how the Kammhuber system worked. British bombers learned the corkscrew maneuver, a violent diving spiral that could break a night fighter's radar lock and throw off his aim. This tactic was developed and perfected using PJ-876, testing exactly how a pilot could escape the 60-degree cone of coverage of the Liechtenstein radar. Navigation improved with better radar bombing systems. H-2S ground mapping radar allowed bombers to find and hit targets through clouds and darkness with unprecedented accuracy. The Pathfinder force marked targets with colored flares, guiding the main force to the aim point. The Luftwaffe introduced more powerful radars, the SN2, the SN3, the Neptune series. Late in the war, they even developed Berlin, a centimetric radar based on captured cavity magnetron technology. But by then it was too late. Production was chaotic. Training was rushed. Fuel was scarce. The Luftwaffe was being ground down by attrition, and through it all, British intelligence kept capturing German equipment, analyzing it, developing countermeasures. The night fighter that landed at Woodbridge in July 1944 provided the SN2 C-2 secrets. Other defections and crashes provided more pieces of the puzzle. The technological race continued, but the momentum had shifted. The Luftwaffe was reacting, adapting, trying to keep up. The initiative belonged to the Allies. Behind these technological developments was a terrible human cost that's easy to forget in the discussion of radar frequencies and countermeasures. Every innovation, every countermeasure deployed or defeated, translated directly into lives saved or lost. When Window was first used over Hamburg, 779 RAF aircrew who might have died came home. When the Flensburg detector made Monaco useless, dozens of bomber crews died without knowing why they'd been found so easily. German night fighter pilots, the Expert 10 who had racked up dozens of kills each, were being shot down by mosquitoes they never saw. British bomber crews were being killed by night fighters whose radar they thought they'd jammed. Cities were burning. Civilians were dying by the tens of thousands. The radar war was fought by scientists and engineers, but the people who lived and died by its outcomes were young men in their 20s, frozen at altitude, hunted through darkness, shot at by flak and fighters, trying to complete their missions and make it home. By the end of 1944, RAF Bomber Command had lost over 55,000 aircrew killed. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force had lost thousands of its own. German cities had been reduced to rubble. The night sky over Europe was a killing ground, and one small radar set, sitting in a captured Junkers Ju-88 at a Scottish airfield in May 1943, had changed how that killing was done. So what did British engineers learn from examining that captured German night fighter radar? What did Herbert Schmid's defection really accomplish? First, it gave the British complete understanding of how the Liechtenstein BC system worked. Its frequencies, its range, its blind spots, its vulnerabilities. That knowledge directly enabled the deployment of window chaff, which saved thousands of lives in the summer and fall of 1943. Second, it revealed the vibration vulnerability. That discovery informed bomber tactics and evasion techniques. The corkscrew maneuver was refined based on understanding exactly how to break the radar's lock. Third, it enabled the development of serrate, turning British night fighters into night fighter hunters. The psychological impact of this reversal on the Luftwaffe was enormous. Fourth, and perhaps most important in the long term, it demonstrated that German technology, despite its reputation, was not invincible. The Liechtenstein radar was sophisticated, but flawed. It could be countered. It could be beaten. That knowledge boosted Allied morale and confidence in the technological war. But there's a broader lesson here about the nature of technological warfare. No weapon system is perfect. No technological advantage is permanent. Every system has vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be discovered and exploited. The Germans had invested enormous resources in their air defense system. The Kammhuber line, ground radars, airborne radars, highly trained night fighter crews. It was a formidable system. At its peak, it was devastating. But one defecting pilot, one captured aircraft, and a few months of intensive analysis by British scientists were enough to find critical weaknesses, to develop countermeasures, to shift the balance of the night war. There's a profound irony in how the radar war played out. Germany had led the world in radar research in the 1930s. The first practical radar systems were German. Christian Hülsmeyer, a German engineer, had demonstrated the basic concept back in 1904. By the start of World War II, German radar was arguably more advanced than British. The Freya and Würzburg systems were sophisticated and effective. The Luftwaffe had thought hard about how to integrate radar into their air defense system, but somewhere along the way, Germany lost the lead. The British, driven by desperate necessity during the Battle of Britain, had innovated faster. The development of the cavity magnetron in 1940 gave them a generational leap in radar capability. The chain-home system, crude as it was, proved devastatingly effective. Germany spent the rest of the war trying to catch up. Every advance the British made, the Germans had to counter. They did so with impressive engineering and determination. The SN2 radar that replaced the vulnerable Liechtenstein BC was a solid piece of work. The Flensburg detector was clever. The Würzburg targeting radar for flak was excellent, but they were always reacting, always one step behind. And that's not where you want to be in a technological arms race, especially when your industrial capacity is being systematically destroyed by the very bombers your defenses are supposed to stop. When German scientists examined that captured British cavity magnetron in February 1943 and realized they were a decade behind, it must have been a sobering moment. All the propaganda about German technical superiority, all the confidence in German engineering excellence, confronted by the reality that in this critical technology, Britain had pulled ahead. That gap never closed. By war's end, Allied radar was so far ahead of German capabilities that it wasn't a contest anymore. British and American aircraft had centimetric radar for navigation, targeting, and ground mapping. German aircraft were still using meter-band radar with massive antennas. Today, Herbert Schmid's Ju-88, aircraft number 3643, sits in the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford. It's one of only 2 intact Ju-88s in existence. Its Liechtenstein BC radar equipment, with its characteristic mattress antenna arrays, is still mounted in the nose. Visitors can walk around it and see the ungainly antenna masts projecting forward. They can imagine what it must have looked like to a British bomber crew, catching a glimpse of those distinctive antennas in the darkness and knowing what they meant. They can picture the radar operator hunched over his 3 cathode ray displays, trying to interpret the returns, guiding his pilot toward the kill. It's a museum piece now, a relic of a different kind of warfare. But for a few critical years, aircraft like this one were some of the most dangerous weapons in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The technology demonstrated in that airframe, primitive as it seems today, represented the cutting edge of radar development in 1943, active radar homing, airborne target tracking, electronic warfare, all concepts that would evolve into the sophisticated systems modern military aircraft carry today. The radar war over Germany in 1943 was a proving ground for concepts that still drive military technology. Electronic countermeasures and countermeasures. The use of passive detection to track active radars. The exploitation of electromagnetic spectrum vulnerabilities. All of it was pioneered in the night skies over Europe. And a significant part of Allied success in that technological war came down to one German pilot who decided he didn't want to fight for Hitler anymore. One intact radar set delivered into British hands, and a team of brilliant scientists who knew exactly what questions to ask. So, did British engineers examining that German night fighter radar realize the Luftwaffe's eyes were failing? Absolutely. The vibration vulnerability, the susceptibility to chaff, the detectable emissions that could be tracked by Serrate, the limited range and field of view, all of it added up to a system that, while dangerous, was fundamentally flawed and could be countered. More broadly, the captured Liechtenstein radar was a window into German technological capabilities. And what British scientists saw through that window was reassuring. German engineering was good, but it wasn't magic. It could be understood, analyzed, and beaten. That realization rippled through Allied intelligence. If German radar had weaknesses, what about their other supposedly invincible weapons? Their tanks? Their submarines? Their jet fighters being whispered about in intelligence reports? None of it was invincible. All of it could be countered, given enough understanding and innovative thinking. The night war over Germany continued until the very end of World War II. Even in 1945, German night fighters were still scoring kills against Allied bombers. The Luftwaffe never stopped fighting, never stopped adapting, never stopped trying to defend their homeland. But the balance had tipped. The Allies could see in the dark better than the Germans. They could jam German radars. They could detect German fighters. They could strike with precision, and it started with one aircraft, one defection, and one critical examination that revealed the truth. The Luftwaffe's electronic eyes, impressive as they seemed, were failing. Not completely, not immediately, but failing nonetheless. The empire of the night that German night fighters had ruled in 1941 and 1942 was crumbling, and by 1944, with thousands of Allied aircraft pouring over Germany every day and night, it would collapse entirely, all because British engineers looked at a captured radar set and asked the right questions, all because they tested it properly, all because they found the weaknesses hidden in the design. That's the power of good intelligence, good science, and good engineering. Not to mention one brave defector who knew which side of history he wanted to be on. Herbert Schmid survived the war. He returned to Bonn. What he thought about his decision in later years, we don't fully know. But the radar he delivered to the British, the intelligence that examination generated, almost certainly saved thousands of Allied lives. And perhaps that's how he justified it to himself. Perhaps that's how he made peace with defecting, with being called a traitor by his countrymen, with the consequences that decision carried. He didn't defeat Nazi Germany by himself. No one person did. But he played his part. He struck a blow. And the night war over Europe would never be the same.